Send your pictures to dear old Captain Noah. Send today, send right away. Send your pictures to dear old Captain Noah. Your colored pic will do the trick. Send your pictures to dear old Captain Noah.
It was hell for me tracking down all the issues of Raw. Like the smaller ones, the Penguin ones are easy to find. You can find those at like any bookstore. But the actual like original tall ones took me years to get them all. The first time I saw them, I had a fellowship at the Center for Cartoon Studies, and they had them in their library. So I would go to their library and look at them. And then when I moved to Columbus, Ohio, I would have to go to the Billy Ireland and specially request for them to bring them out of the files. When I was like, okay, well, I'm going to be leaving Columbus at some point, and also I want to build up my own collection, so I'm going to need to get my own copies of these. So it was a real thing. Like, I'm going to gather up as much money as I can, like specifically for these early issues of Raw.
But, we didn't do them to make them scarce. Like, but I think the first issue cost $3.50, which was already a nosebleed for people buying underground comics at whatever 50 cents. But the first issue only had about 3,500 or 4,000 copies. It was originally supposed to be 5,000, but there were enough misprints, so we had to trash them.
Oh man!
Going through them one by one to see which copies didn't have like gray pages and skid marks on them, because we were using a really cheap commercial printer in the neighborhood.
Oh, okay.
And as somebody, I think the binder that we worked with, who became very friendly with us, said, when you work with one of these printers, you can get three things. You can either get quality, price, or speed. And sometimes you can get two of them, but usually you just get that. The only way we were able to make this work on our budget, because it should have been printed a lot more expensively, but it came out expensive after the first issue because of the aforementioned skills of my amazing spouse, because she knew how to print. She was offered a print job in one of those kind of places if she wanted it after she graduated from this trade after school, mostly with just kids who were studying refrigerator repair or whatever. One of them was printing. So she didn't do that, but she knew how to do it. So when we went to this place that we'd use, there was this really kind of dumb as a stick printer who was the main man on press. And he had absolutely no use for a woman in his shop. The only way women could be in the shop were as pinups on the walls, but no humans. And so we'd be looking at press proofs and the make ready, and then Francoise would say, could you just put more yellow, turn up the yellow? And he'd do almost nothing, just glowering at her. And then do it again. And then my job, because I had no idea how to do this stuff, I'd say, I don't think his name was Eddie. Eddie, come with me. Let me show you something at the window. And I'd take him to the window and say, see this yellow over here? It's barely present. While I was making that last for about 5 minutes, she would get a stool, stand up on the press, and turn the crank to put up the yellow the way we wanted it. And then he would go back and pretend to turn the yellow up again, because why are these people bothering him? And it would be fine. So that was how we printed.
Wow. There was a breakthrough moment for you, but that's one of the questions I want to ask you about, was what that was. Was that Prisoner on the Hell Planet or something, where all of a sudden you were like, oh, I've been trying to do too much kind of silly stuff and I should be doing this instead?
No, it was gradual. I would say I do think of the 3-page version of Mouse as my breakthrough work. So I found an area to think through and from. And then bit by bit, it's that early work and breakdowns that was my formative thing. But if you look at the early work and breakdowns, it includes Prisoner on the Hell Planet, the 3-page Mouse, Don't Get Around Much Anymore, the Malpractice Suite, the Rex Morgan thing, and Ace Hole. And if you can recognize the style in that, that's great. But I think most people wouldn't be able to. Like casual lookers wouldn't find. The main thing that they all have in common is I don't draw hands well. So whenever I can get away with putting a bunch of bananas at the end of the wrist, I do. So there are certain deficiencies that make up my style, but there wasn't any attempt to even locate one. I was trying to draw like an underground cartoonist. And then for Mouse, even the 3-page Mouse, I wanted something a bit more sober, let alone what happened when I was searching for a way to do the long book. And Prisoner on the Hell Planet and a lot of work that came in that period was a result of finally getting interested in art, you know?
And was Prisoner on the Hell Planet, was that actually in Scratchboard, or it
Yeah,
was? So
yeah.
how do you do that? Do you have to photocopy the Scratchboard and then paste it down on the Bristol where you need it? Because
I just did it all on Scratchboard.
the entire page is Scratchboard?
Well, why not? It's just a
I
paper.
don't know. I just feel like that would be so much work.
Everything is too much work for me. But I never learned that lesson that you learned of, like, you're in a studio, everybody else is producing, go to it. You know, the best I would have is for a month or so, I'd be working in the same place as Bill Griffith or something, you know.
Oh yeah.
But I never, and he's very disciplined as well. I'm just not. But what it was for me was you could get bristlepboard, and good quality bristlepboard back then, either clay coated in white or in black.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. So for one thing, I mean, you still can, but if you get white bristlepboard, then it's like working. I'm sorry, scratchboard. If you get white scratchboard, you could do all the stuff you would do on a paper. Just the ink would hit a little bit differently, and if you made mistakes or blopped it, you could scratch away where the line got a little funny.
Yeah.
But then you'd ink in a large black area and scratch away the parts that you wanted to have look more like thin white engraved or wood engraved or woodcut lines. And I really liked Scratchboard a lot until I worked on something called The Wild Party. And then I've gotten nausea every time I see that stuff, because
you don't like that?
It didn't feel like too much work doing a 4-page strip or a few other things I did that were short, but doing something where I took what would have been, I was only supposed to do about 12 illustrations.
Mm-hmm.
But then I had this idea, which was nuts, which is something Jay Lynch taught me from one of his LSD trips, which was art, the ultimate in any concept is its opposite. And at that point I went, okay, I'm going to illustrate and I only have to do about 10 or 12 illustrations. Scratchboard is obvious. But then I figured being an illustrator is a terrible thing to be, because on the one hand, you're sort of decorating somebody else's work.
Yeah.
And for another thing, you're fucking robbing them blind. They're trying to describe a location or a person. And you go, oh, I think that guy has a really big nose. And from then on, anybody who approaches the book sees somebody with a really big nose. So you're both giving and taking away from the primary author, let's call it, unless you're in collaboration with them, the way, say, John Tenniel and Lewis Carroll were for Alice in Wonderland. But in order to do the ultimate in any concept being its opposite, I figured if I over illustrate it, then it'll be less of a robbery and more of an insertion of myself. So that there's no reason to, for instance, illustrate a couplet, which was, he gave her wrist a twist. Just a tiny illustration going about a quarter of the page, and it shows a meaty hand twisting the wrist of a more delicate hand, and has an arrow showing whether it was clockwise or counterclockwise.
Mm-hmm.
So that's over illustrating.
Yeah.
And then when talking about, there's an earlier line, it's just, these are examples, but like in this rhyming 1920s jazz age poem that was banned in Boston and inspired William Burroughs, as I found out when actually having dinner with him the one time we did that. Wild Party, the book that made me want to be a writer because it was so off color. And it had gay characters in it, actually. But anyway, when early in the poem, it's like talking about the men she 16 a year were her order. They might be blackguards, they might be curs, they might be actors, sports chauffeurs. She never inquired of the men she desired about their social status or wealth. She was only concerned about their health. So for that picture, I drew a grid with the same face over and over again, one looking like a chauffeur, one dressed as a cur. Like just doing that kind of thing of like a grid with the same face, indicating that these faces are all arbitrary. So there were ways in which I could inhabit it. But working on Scratchboard became such a chore compared to the rough sketches for it that a few of them came out as work I'm proud of, and others are like, oh God, I just can't bear to do this again. So there'd be a certain point where I'd give up, and that became the illustration. So for me, at least, there's a lot of varying quality in that book, but
Yeah.
but it didn't come out bad as a book. It had a good flip, as they call it.
Yeah.
different ways of having layouts across it. But it made me wary of being an illustrator, you know.
Mhm.
And I'm just interested, like, do you think I have a recognizable style? Because I don't quite recognize it.
Oh, I can always tell. I can.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sure there are concerns that are consistent, but I always think of the style as an aspect of the narrative.
Hmm.
You know, in other words, this is something I think I got from looking at Bernie Krigstein's work. Like when he would do a story that was set in Ray Bradbury's version of Japan, he would be looking at Japanese art and make it that way. Some other things that would be looking at German expressionist stuff and would sign his work Caligari Krigstein. Some of it looked like super, at that point, ultra modern, the way Dan Clowes tried to be in the beginning of
Yeah,
his career.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so he had variations, and style really was part of, a function of the storytelling. And
Mhm.
I took that to heart. And so I tried to just figure it out while I was going along. What should this particular piece look like? So I'm reminded of a quote that I read by Picasso decades ago uh, that said, the difference between a perfect circle and the way I draw it is my style.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the case. I just can't do it any better than I can do it, but I'm aiming at something. And so,
Yeah.
uh, at least on the surface, things shift. I use different inking tools. I uh, try different degrees of abstraction or exaggeration depending on what I'm working on. And it's been useful, but it doesn't allow me to be efficient. Like you have a body of work.
Mhm.
I have a torso of work, you know.
Well,
Um,
is it, I've never had like real success in the way that you have. So like, is that sort of a paralyzing thing to have that kind of success with mouse where like you can't just do like another graphic novel because people are expecting it to be something really
I,
big?
I don't even didn't even know I should do one.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, the thing is that I was never prolific, even when I was working all the time. I could get things done,
Mhm.
uh, but yeah, success was, it's stupid. It's like saying, "Oh wow, my Lexus has dirty ashtrays and I can't afford another one right now." Um, it's been both a blessing and a curse, you know.
Yeah.
But I had the curse beforehand, which is a great degree of self-loathing for what comes out of my hand.
Hmm.
Uh, and as a result, I would just have to do things again and work harder on them or let them be bad and move on after that. But I couldn't do what Griffith does naturally, which is you do the best you can and you do the next one and do it better, which is a much more intelligent way to work.
Yeah.
But I can't do it. I can't. Or I can do one piece that way, you
Hmm.
know. And I go back and hate what I'd abandoned to do the new. It My psyche is not built for it. With Maus or without Maus, I probably would have had a very stuttery career of very short works. And frankly, those two projects I described, The Life in Ink with Skeeter Grant,
Yeah.
or what became Maus, I wanted to do something ambitious. Like that became sort of a given. Even though it could lead to something pretentious, I was willing to take the risk because there are worse sins than pretension.
Hmm.
Uh, I think that actually Krigstein committed some of them, but he's one of the great comic artists of all time. Each project was its own thing, and when I wanted to do Mouse, the whole idea was I wanted to do a very long comic book. It should have it should look more like a book than like a Dell Giant or something. Uh, and I wanted it to have book flaps or a hardcover, and it should be more sized like a book than a comic book.
Hmm.
And so I had that formal notion before I even knew what the fuck I was doing.
Hmm.
That's what I wanted to make. And as it went along, you know, when I was trying to find a publisher, I did have some comics publishers willing to publish it in France as well as here, like as it was chugging along. And I knew I didn't want that. I wanted something that belonged with books.
Yeah.
But I didn't have the phrase in my head of a graphic novel. It just wasn't there. What I had was the same thing that Eisner had, which is there's a fanzine that came out, I think in the 70s, that I read whenever I could get it by Bill Spicer, I think, called Graphic Story Magazine.
Oh yeah.
And Graphic Story Magazine posited the idea that comics could be smarter than they are, but the word comics doesn't help. Uh, so, what would a comic be if it didn't have to be stupid? And so a lot of what they covered was that kind of work. And in the course of it, they covered, I think, Mazariel's work in one issue, if I'm not misremembering, but a lot of stuff. And we're publishing things by obscure cartoonists who fell somewhere between fanzine and underground comics, like
Mhm.
George Metzger,
Mhm.
know that name,
Yeah.
uh, was trying to do a very ambitious science fiction comic strip. It was a short story. And so they were positing that as a graphic story, not a comic book story. So that was in my head, but I never had any problem even with the word. You know, I like comics. I love comics. I think some of them are as intelligent as anything I've ever seen in any medium. Um, and eventually I got to like, as you probably have read tediously more than once, but I like the word comics rather than comics because it just meant mixing together words and pictures. But in any case, I didn't have a problem with the word. I just wanted to make a long comic book that needed a bookmark, and ideally one that could be reread the way some of the novels I love I reread, because it's only when you reread them that you fall past that first layer of just another pretty face and move on, you know. So that was the ambition, but it's never like I figured now I'm going to do these. Even when I finished Mouse, I had no intention of doing long pieces. I started doing short pieces again. And in fact, because I had to look through some of my old papers recently, I did this really stupid thing after I got a Pulitzer Prize, which is my agent was great, Andrew Wiley, great agent, great people he represents, said, okay, Art, you got the Pulitzer Prize. We've got to go in and get you $100,000 advance for your next work, which at the time felt like as big money could be to me. I said, oh, but I don't have another work. I said, don't worry, we'll just call it work one. And we'll have a 2-book contract and we'll get you over $100,000. I just saw this correspondence yesterday while looking for something else. I went, but I don't want it. And said, you're just never going to be hotter than you are now. Let me just do this. And so we did it. I still had no idea of what I was doing, except all this money was flooding into my bank account. But I was also now beginning to get royalties from Mouse that was selling better by being a Pulitzer Prize winning 2 volumes and whatever. And after a certain point, I don't know how many years, like maybe 2, I went, this is making me lose sleep. I can't stand it. I can't stand knowing that I'm supposed to be working on another book. I started working on that book called The Wild Party. Because I was sort of interested in doing something that was decorative, that looked more graphic than Mouse looked at superficially, that was a little bit osé, off color. That would just be more, I thought, pleasurable. So that was called book 1, and I was supposed to do some other, and I was working on that one anyway, so it's working off part of my debt, but I realized I'm never going to make it. So even though I'd read something that F. Scott Fitzgerald said, which was an important axiom of his, which was never give money back to a publisher. But I had to violate it. I said, I just can't live like this. So I gave back an enormous sum to the publisher, minus the 10% royalty to the Wiley agency, which I just had to pay out of pocket. But I was making money then. I mean, money was coming in from Mouse and even from the Wild Party. And I think by the time I was doing the Wild Party, I was getting money for ongoing work for the New Yorker that had hired me after. So it wasn't an impossible thing. It just made me able to sleep at night, because I didn't think then, and I don't think now, even though I've made a couple of forays and attempts, I've abandoned them at doing another graphic novel. I don't think, who was it? Like, which blues musician said, I'm built for comfort, not for speed?
That's like you.
That's me, except I'm not as heavy as he was. I can't remember if it was That's Domino or who it was, but some musician's line in one of his songs that I could take to heart, I guess, although I never connected it till right now. I just couldn't do another graphic novel without making it the life work.
But then like that freedom, like giving back that money, didn't that kind of then all of a sudden free you up to go like, oh, now I'm going to do In the Shadow of No Towers, which could have been book 2 from that contract?
It was quite a few years later.
Yeah, that's true.
That's how I did it. I mean, we're talking about late 80s, early 90s.
Oh, okay.
Or no, I'm sorry, early 90s.
Yeah.
It's when I started working with the New Yorker. And I wasn't thinking about making a book. I was thinking about making covers and pages for the New Yorker and for a few other random places.
Yeah, which there's actually a book of yours I wanted to ask you about that I've never been able to find. There's foreign editions of it, which is a collection of all of your New Yorker stuff.
It never came out here. I was supposed to do it and never got around to it.
Oh, God damn it.
It could have been book 2. But it came out in French and German and Italian. So it has all the images, but it doesn't have a rather lame essay that ran through it with my grievances against the New Yorker.
Rereading Comic Art number 5, I reread your interview in that. And there's a part in there and I'm like, oh yeah, that book. And I went on Google again. I'm like, is that out yet? I never even heard anything. And it's like, I just found like a French edition, like a German edition or something, and it was like,
Yeah, the French edition came out especially beautiful, great paper. And that's still around, that's still in print. So you could get it knowing there'll never be an American one if you have a reminder.
well, what about is the Paul Auster forward? Is that in English or is that in French?
Oh, that's another book. Oh, wait, let me think. No, that's I think it might be bilingual in that book. I'd have to look at that edition to see. But it was printed in a collection of his essays for years. It's mostly about the black on black cover. I was happy to be at the New Yorker because I'd never really read it when I was a kid. What I really liked were looking at the cartoons in dentists' offices and getting collections of Arno and Charles Adams and stuff. But I didn't have much more respect for the New Yorker than she did. So, in terms of its sanctity. So, she said, I was just hired to do stuff. So the first thing I did was a comics page, 2 pages about a trip to East Germany where,
oh yeah,
that thing Rostock,
Nazi,
where the
yeah,
Nazi attack. Did that as a spread. I think a couple of spot illustrations or drawings inside, illustrations maybe. And then she said, but you should be doing covers as well. And that's what led to that Valentine cover. And that got so much more attention than I ever dreamed it could get. The Hasidic Jew kissing a West Indian or African American black woman, right in the wake, relatively in the wake of the Crown Heights riots, of the violence there between the two communities. And she kept going off and on about whether she would run that thing. She wanted it right away. She said, "Oh, this is great. This is what I've been looking for. It was a Valentine's Day issue." Yeah. And I did it actually. Do you mind if I totally free associate? You can always edit shit out.
Yeah. Don't worry about
it. But I did the cover because it would run on Valentine's Day. And if you've read Maus, there's a magic date for my father, which was Parshas Truma, where a certain part of the Torah is read every year. Mm-hmm. And that always falls around February 15th. And he had a dream back in the camps that he'd be released from the prisoner of war camp on Parshas Truma, which was months away. And it came to pass. And then realized he'd been married on Parshas Truma. And then when I was born on Parshas Truma. And before I totally escaped his clutches, had a bar mitzvah in which I had to read exactly that part of the Torah. So I've always considered it insofar as I believe everything in the world is kind of random, but I do notice when we're coming around to a mid-February date. Yeah. So I figured that would be a good one to do my first cover for the New Yorker. It turned out to be this one. All I was trying to do was find out what would Eustace Tilley look like if he was a Hasid.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what led to that cover. Yeah. And as soon as she got it, she hid it. This was early in her reign at the New Yorker, and she didn't want any of the other kibitzers and editors to see it because she knew they wouldn't let her do it. It had nothing to do with the New Yorker's DNA. And then what saved it was Charles Burns. Because, here's what happened. At the same time that happened, there's going to be an anniversary issue of the New Yorker. It was going to be the week after, I think, because they're both mid-February. And wanted drawings by various people, including me, Charles Burns, who may have already done one or of the couple of covers he did, but maybe not yet. He did the most monstrous Tilley anybody's ever done with his giant goiter neck and whatever. Anyway, so she showed this portfolio of Tilley's that she was going to run in the week after.
So the people at the New Yorker saw Charles Burns' awful Eustace Tully drawing, and they were like,
one of the old editors, I can't right now remember which one, just went, I quit. She had just been on there for like a few months and said, like, this is you can't do this. You can't do this. She said, well, I want to pep the magazine up a little bit. Well, what about this? I was planning on this for the Valentine's cover. Oh, that's nothing. That's okay. He would never have said that if it was the first thing he had seen. But once he had seen Charles Burns' thing, mine fell in the world of normalcy, you know? And so I don't know what happened to his picture, whether that got published as part of the portfolio or whatever. I'd have to look back over the magazines. I think some of it got published because I was playing a lot on my computer at the time, and I did a cubist version of Tilley, all scrambled up and whatever. Yeah. It's in that New Yorker book, I think. But in any case, I think it ran, but I'm not sure. Still, it was so horrific that I just seemed like I was just like Helen Hokinson or something, you know?
So that cover is what started your career at New Yorker, at the New Yorker, as far as cover, like being a cover?
That was the first cover. She did ask me to do covers, and that was something you can't know. In the world before the internet, this was as big a worldwide event as Pepe the Frog.
Yeah.
It was just intense. Nobody expected it, including me. I just thought that's at least a cover that's not like these pictures of Connecticut trees or something,
Yeah, that's right.
And the first cover of the New Yorker by Tina was a really elegant cover by uh, Edward Sorel of a contemporary-looking young man riding in a carriage through Central Park, but he looked like, I don't remember if he had a mohawk or something, but he definitely didn't look like the typical New Yorker male. And that was like riding through this resplendent Central Park, but indicating that something new was coming. Great cover. And she loved Sorel's work and used him a lot. But that didn't change anything except announce what Tina said she was going to do, which is change the New Yorker, like give it a contents page, make it so that it was a must-read magazine every week rather than something you could read 5 years later. Uh, uh, and it still tried, and Tina's magazine was great when she was working with a deep archive of what the New Yorker had been up to that point, because she had all those great articles on like geology of rocks that would run for 3 issues.
Mm-hmm.
She had a big bank of that kind of stuff, so she could put that in, and then some kind of insane, I don't know, piece about Roseanne Barr or something, or name her co-editor for one issue, or whatever she did that was getting absolute crazy attention. So this cover comes out, the Hasidic Kiss. I'm in Florida with my baby daughter and Francoise because there's a show of Mao's work being shown in a museum there that Mort Walker had set up. So we're there for that. And all of a sudden, the phone is flying off the hook. It's the PR person from the New Yorker saying, okay, don't talk to anybody and don't pick up your phone unless it's through me, okay? Okay. And it turns out that everybody in New York wanted to talk to me about this crazy cover. The New Yorker rarely even acknowledged that there were things like Jews and blacks ever. It just wasn't part of their reality for the most part. And here having them oscillate was just too kind of over the edge for them, even though it looked very kind of modernistic somehow, like Chagall-like maybe, or something. But in any case, everybody wanted to talk about this cover. We were just about to leave for the airport. They got somebody to accompany us from the New Yorker who was down in Florida, and to protect us from, I thought this was nuts. But when we got to the airport, we have our suitcases with us. I'm with my wife and daughter. We have been surrounded by absolute all of America's media.
Mm-hmm.
And it really looked like we were trying to escape to Cuba.
Was that done on the computer, or was that watercolor?
That was a watercolor. But I did a lot of covers for the New Yorker during that period and after. But that was totally a painting.
But when did you start phasing into using more tablets and stuff like that, digital?
I first started messing around with a Mac when they were really little machines, one part bodies, like I don't know what year, but it would now be in a Mac museum somewhere. And I couldn't get near a computer in the days when Francoise was using it because she was, God, I mean, I'm not bragging on her. I'm just kind of awed by what she can do. So she taught herself to program in DOS and made up the mailing lists for RAW. And
It's just incredible.
But I'm looking at this computer and it's all key punched, and you had to learn the programming language, and it was all like yellow or white on green or black.
Mm-hmm.
I had no interest in that machine. But as soon as I saw a Mac, I went, that could be fun. Mm-hmm. So we had one. I had very early, I got one. It was an early version of Photoshop where there was no real history state, so you could undo. But if you had to undo 2 steps, you couldn't do it. So the result was I treated it not as a work machine, but as a version of Donkey Kong. Mm-hmm. I just started drawing on it. I'd be using a mouse because they didn't have tablets then. Mm-hmm. And as Gary Panter said, drawing with a mouse is like drawing with a pencil sharpener rather than a pencil.
Yes, that's great.
So I was just doing it for fun, just like inviting other people to it. And look, you can distort it and you can chop it up and you can do all this shit with it. And so then I'd sort of taught myself Photoshop by playing Donkey Kong, mm-hmm. drawing version of Donkey Kong. And eventually they caught up with being able to make it have history states and
Mm.
made it a lot easier. And I think whenever that was, so it would be very late 80s, early 90s, I'd have probably around the time I was getting interested in the New Yorker, I began interested in seeing if I could do finished art. It's hard to do something high enough DPI because it was real slow.
Yeah.
But I began to learn some tricks, and I finally got to use them again. Like I went through a long period where um, my work just started being on the computer. I do sketches and put them in sometimes, scan them in, but very often just doodling on the computer would lead to the final image.
Mhm.
But the problem with that was there were no originals. There were just little scraps that got fed in and turned into the image. And it began to feel very alienating after I got to be good at it. Because at that point, I couldn't even remember if I'd done something on a computer or by hand.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and ultimately, I wanted to return to paper.
Mm.
So must have started in the early 90s and gone on into sometime around the year 2000, maybe I started like weaning myself back to paper.
Oh, okay.
But I still do it both ways. And it finally came in handy in this book that is the occasion for this interview we've now gone on for a couple of hours about without mentioning.
Street cop.
Street Cop, my big project for a year. Like it's smaller than a pack of cigarettes, basically about the size of a pack of cigarettes, smaller than my iPhone screen, maybe. I don't know. But it took me forever to do this. And for the most part, I was making drawings, scanning them in, and doing the color on the computer. But also, as Gilbert Shelton once said about computers, the other great line was, "Man, I got myself a computer, most expensive fucking whiteout I ever bought." So that's what I started doing. Is like I see one of the reasons I liked Scratchboard was you could undo and redo. Like if you didn't like the line, you'd scrape it out lightly and then put another line in. No problem. You had several whacks at it with good Scratchboard before you hit bedrock.
Yeah.
And then you could use whiteout on it if you really had to. So I was doing this book and it took me forever. Like I don't even know how it could have taken me so long. And it was again trying to solve the problem of what does it mean to illustrate something.
Mhm.
And I got attracted by its size, which was I like book objects, as you know from our raw
Yeah.
days
Yeah.
and beyond. Um, and even Mouse, as I said, came from thinking of the object before how it would get filled.
Mhm.
So working this small size, I gotten this book done. I can go back and say more about that, but to make at least vaguely a point connected to the previous point, I didn't draw one set of pictures that were just too hard. I'd been given dispensation by Kluver to do anything I wanted, absolutely anything. He didn't care. So if you don't like the story, just draw something else. Uh, so I had carte blanche, and of course, perversely, when he said that, I figured I got to draw the story. I got to draw it pretty much following every connecting dot. I had one part of the story I just couldn't even visualize, which was so there's a point where all this stuff turns into like you find out that the city is sort of made as a kind of plastic printout, and
Yeah.
therefore you can get up and walk around. Uh, the city hall steps can melt, rooms can change around. I just couldn't visualize that stuff. So I just worked around it, taking advantage of his loophole. Did enough pictures to be more than credible for the overall number of images in the book, but felt like I'd cheated and said, "Can we just stop here to the very nice small press of small press series of books that size?" And they said, "Sure, man, whatever you want." So everybody let me do what I want. I
Yeah.
felt guilty for not having solved it, but time was up. I spent from April to December doing about 8 or 10 pictures.
Wow.
Did a couple of other things, but mostly thinking this through, trying to figure out what it should be and how to do it. It was the way I centered myself during the twin viruses of Trump and COVID. I didn't have anything better to do. I was going to work in my sketchbook, and I'm working on another project that's more words than pictures, which is a pilot for Amazon Prime with
Oh, that's cool.
and a director named Alza Jacobs. But that doesn't take up that drawing part of your hand. My hand, I've done less and less because of my, not humble bragging, because of my neuroses, my
Mhm.
difficulty. So I was just going to keep a sketchbook because when I've done that, it really has primed the pump. This thing came along. I figured, great, it's a dystopia, but it's not the one I'm living through. Let me do this instead. And it turned out more and more as I was working on it, it was about our dystopia. In any case, each of those pictures, even the ones that look really simple, was a battle, and they would lead sometimes to 15 drawings, 20 drawings for the one, some of them looking really stupid, but I was going to correct them on the machine. But in any case, that whole process reopened up after January 6th.
Mm.
Like when the Capitol got invaded by Martians,
Yeah.
I went, okay, all work on the screenplay has stopped. All work everywhere has stopped. Even at the New Yorker, things seem to have stopped, and not at the same time in the other room of our cabin where Francoise was working on her gig. So I could do anything I wanted, and the only thing I could do was doom scroll. And I figured, now's the time to revisit those pages. Phew. So this book was just a nutty project. I never thought, I mean, I felt like I was returning to my underground comics roots. I had no expectation of people seeing it. I'm now on the big publicity tour where I'm on the big shows like yours,
That's right.
and it was a way of just letting myself do what I needed and wanted to do, which is find a way to focus my attention and energy and make something.
Mm.
And it just took forever. Decisions like which yogurt to buy can take me a half hour sometimes, depending on where my brain is. And it's only gotten worse during COVID. But the thing was, I was drowning in a very large teacup when I was doing Mouse. It was a giant teacup. Anybody would drown in it because there were no rules of how to make this thing. I understand that there were like long manga and a couple of precursors of one kind or another, but that kind of book I just didn't have any template for. So I had to make every mistake possible, which is part of the 13-year process of getting Mouse made. And now I was on a book that I thought would be a month or two. I could do 10 pictures small, it would be over. Instead, it became most of a year off, not mostly off and on, but mostly on when I wasn't working on the writing project.
During one of the craziest years for news ever.
Yes, but wanting to avoid it. I'd done in the very beginning when Trump got elected, I did a few drawings in my sketchbook and a couple of things that were published in Resist magazine, which I don't know if you've seen or not. That
I've seen the Francois.
There's a thing Francoise and Nadja did together.
Yeah.
So I'd done a couple of Trump-related pictures, but I hated doing it. I hated it. I did it even in my sketchbook, hating it, not thinking it would get published, because I figured if you even if you hate and make fun of and criticize a narcissist, you make him bigger. Because the main thing is the attention, not positive negatives. It's just he swallows all attention. And that's exactly what his presidency had been. So drawing him seemed like a sucker's game.
Yeah.
And that gave me no outlet for this stuff. And I always had a tendency to be disorganized, and certainly COVID tripled it, not knowing how to stay focused, still going on. And that's why this interview is going to be one of your epic length conversations, I believe.
I'm enjoying it, trust me.
Okay, but basically trying to figure out how to do this was doing it, and that meant I drowned this time in a small teacup, but it felt as big as Mouse while I was working on it.
Yeah.
It had theses in it. It had not feces, but theses, which had to do with what does it mean to illustrate something. And again, it was partially over illustrating, but partially being too literal. So that what I would do is I'd enter a picture as a double page spread, but it had comic book writing in it. And his story is wonderfully loopy, going from, I loved Coover's writing anyway over.
I didn't know anything about him before I read this.
Oh, he was really a beloved master by the end of the 20th century for what they called, but he rejects the term totally, as does any good one, postmodernist. Writing the version of postmodernism that was thoroughly erudite, like he teaches Gilgamesh when he taught at Brown. He's now at 89, I think. But his stories are very knowledgeable. They're very involved with language, as that one sentence I quoted had it. Some of his whole stories are built on certain things you can do grammatically, but they don't feel pretentious. They're hilarious. Some of them are absolutely insanely sexual. Most of them have a political dimension to them. If he was a bit younger, he'd probably get canceled, but I think he might be safe now. And the thing is, I liked his drawings ever since, his writing ever since a collection of his stories came out called Prick Songs and Descants, then followed him in McSweeney's, in The New Yorker, and a novel that he wrote called The Public Burning, which was a very political novel about Senator Nixon hunting down the Rosenbergs and finally executing them as part of a giant public spectacle in Times Square. And hilarious, frightening, amazing, slightly more difficult than his short stories, books, but his stuff always was with me. And when somebody approached me, these very small publishers, nobody, including me, had ever heard of except their circle, would you be willing to illustrate? Coover asked us to get in touch with you and see if you would draw a novella he just wrote before lockdown that we're going to publish as a book, and we want to illustrate it. And I said, as long as there's no mice or Jews, I'd like to read it, you know? And lo and behold, there weren't. And the format just really intrigued me. How do you make a tiny book that doesn't look like it's a microfiche book?
Yeah, right.
How do you fill the pages as full as you can without making it look any more crowded than a Will Elder panel?